Hi, and welcome to this video lesson on tense aspect in English. My name is Jory Lindley. I'm currently a visiting assistant professor at IPFW, that's Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, soon to become Purdue Fort Wayne in beautiful Fort Wayne, Indiana. This video is for students in one of my classes, but it's such a basic piece of the grammar of English that I thought I would make it a more general video and make it publicly available. So whoever you are listening to this, I hope you find it helpful. What this video lecture will cover is mainly the 12 tense aspects of English, which we get from combining the 3 tenses, past, present, and future, with the 4 aspects, simple, progressive, perfect, and perfect progressive. And the goal, the focus, is on just recognizing the forms, being able to label them, or being able to produce examples of them on command. So just feeling comfortable with the terms and knowing roughly how they're used. So there are so many nuances, I'll say later, of how they're used and what they can be said to mean, and unfortunately I have to boil it down into something much simpler than that. The goal is just to sort of get you recognizing or being able to produce them and comfortable with the terminology. Now, other things in the video all support this main goal. I'll cover, like, for example, the 5 verb forms and auxiliary be and have, and then while I'm talking about those, I'll also talk about auxiliary do, and I'll conclude by talking about how English technically lacks a future tense and options for expressing the future tense in English anyways, and summarize everything, and that'll be the end of it. This video is going to cover the 12 tense aspects of English, which we get from combining the 3 tenses, past, present, future, and the 4 aspects, simple, progressive, perfect, and the combination perfect, progressive, for a total of 12. And then everything else in the lecture kind of relates to that or builds up to that. So we'll cover the 5 verb forms in English and what auxiliary verbs are, auxiliary be, have, and sort of as a bonus, auxiliary be, do, and also talk about how English technically lacks future tense and how we express future tense in English anyways. Now, 3 preliminary concepts I need to cover are person, number, and gender. They're relevant to a discussion of tense and aspect because they can dramatically affect the form a verb takes, at least in many languages. They barely do this in English, but they're critical grammatical concepts nevertheless. Person refers to 3 possibilities. First person, which you can think of as the speaker, I or we. Second person, which you can think of as the person the speaker is talking to, you. And third person, which is a person or people or thing or things that are being talked about, he, she, it, or they. The second thing, number, refers to exactly that, how many. For example, I and we are both first person, but I is singular and we is plural. And he, she, it, and they are all third person, but they is plural and the rest, he, she, it, are singular. Most languages only have singular and plural for number, but some have dual for when there's exactly 2 of something. English used to do this, but we lost it. And some have special forms for a few, and I think some might have forms for trial for 3. Finally, there's gender, and we're talking about grammatical gender here, which may or may not overlap with non-grammatical gender. But in English, it does overlap completely, except for some rare exceptions. So by this, I mean that we use the masculine he for males, feminine she for females, and neuter it for things like books and houses. Now, you'll notice I've been talking about pronouns as my examples mainly. It's because these are the only nouns that English marks for gender. We do mark almost all of our nouns as singular or plural. We can say dog or dogs, puppy or puppies, but we don't mark nouns for person, first, second, or third person, except for pronouns, and we don't mark nouns for gender, except for pronouns. But there are other languages, of course, that mark that, whether they mark it or not, every noun is either masculine or masculine, feminine, or neuter. And actually, gender just means kind, so there are languages that have more than 3 genders. For example, you could have a gender that is just something, a little marker on the end of every noun that refers to an animal that swims in the sea, or every noun that refers to an item that human beings made as opposed to something you find in nature. So a better modern word A better word for gender would probably just be group or class, but we're stuck with gender, which people tend to associate with masculine and feminine, but there are other options. But anyways, even within pronouns, this is the only place where you see gender marking on nouns in English, even within the pronouns, we only see gender on the third person and only the third person singular. He, she, or it. But you're supposed to be learning about verbs in this video, not pronouns, right? Well, the reason I'm talking about person, number, and gender and giving you examples of pronouns to illustrate those concepts is that the person, number, and gender of the subject, the person or thing doing the action, whether we use a pronoun for that thing or not, can affect the form of the verb. In English, this is very simple though. So here's the verb to love on the screen, and we see that no matter who's doing the loving or how many people are doing the loving, it almost always looks the same. It's just love. The only exciting thing that happens in English is that we get this little S, which I marked in red, if it's third person and singular. So I love, you love, they love, we love, you plural love, they love, but he, she, or it loves. So this is why we call this the third person singular present tense marker. Not only does it only happen with third person and singular, it only happens in the present tense. So in past tense, this would all just be loved. It would all just have a D or ED at the end. So we have this thing where the verb in English is affected by the subject only when it's third person singular in present tense. Which isn't the case in all languages. So if you're wondering why do we bother drawing up charts like this when really all we need to do is say third person singular is one way and everything else is another way. Well, in other languages, you can have different forms for each of the possible person and number combinations. So here we have Russian, present tense, the verb to read, and we have first person singular, I read, I читаю. But if it's we read, it's читаем. And you singular reads читаешь, you plural read is читаете, and third person singular, he, she, it reads читает, and finally, third person plural, they read читают. So I читаю, we читаем, you читаешь, singular, or читаете, plural, he, she, it читает, they читают. So there's a lot of possibilities in Russian that we don't have in English, so it's much more complicated and you need lots of charts when you're learning Russian. Now, you'll notice here that even in Russian and in English, gender is not affecting the forms. Gender does matter for a lot of the grammar of Russian, just not here and not in the present tense, but what's interesting is that if you go to the past tense of the verb, it does matter in Russian. And then things that matter for the present tense don't matter anymore. This is the verb talk in the past tense in Russian, and we have one form that we use for feminine singular, one form for masculine singular, one form for neuter singular, and one form for plural, no matter what the gender. And person doesn't play into this at all. So in the present tense, we care about person and number, and in the past tense, we don't care about gender in present tense. In past tense, we care about gender and number, and we don't care about person. So I would use the feminine form, whether I was talking about myself, I read, or another female, she read. It doesn't matter if it's first person or third person. If it's female and singular, it gets говорила. And if it's plural, it gets говорили. It doesn't matter if it's first person we or third person they. Whatever it is, if it's plural, it gets one ending. And why is it like this in Russian? Why don't we have the 6 different forms? And why does gender only matter in the past tense and not the present? There's not a correct answer there, but it's just the way it is. So gender, person, and number can affect verb forms, but they do so very little in English. Now all that talk of the third person present singular S leads us nicely into the next thing I need to cover as preliminary to diving deeper into tense aspect. And these are the inflectional suffixes in English. There are 8 of these. We do have more suffixes in English, or a suffix is just some little thing that attaches to the end of a word. We have other other ones, but they're not inflectional. They're a different type that I won't talk about here. But these are the 8 inflectional ones, the sort of grammatical markings that we use in English. 8 is very few for a language. English is not a highly inflectional language. We have 8, and we can divide them into categories based on which type of word they attach to. So we have noun inflections. We can put the S plural on nouns, and we could put the possessive S, like the school's sign. This is the apostrophe S. We also have adjective and adverb inflections, so we can say big, bigger, biggest. And then we have 4 verb inflections. One, which we just talked about at length, the third person present singular. And there's also ed for past tense. And then we have these 2 participles, en and ing. It's a little confusing maybe that they're called past and present when both of those forms can be seen in sentences that are actually in past, present, or future tense. But you'll just have to memorize those names. That's what they're called, the past participle and the present participle. This is like I had eaten, I have eaten, I will have eaten, and I was running, I am running, I will be running. So if you think about this, if we have 4 verb inflections, 4 things that we're able to add to verbs, and we also have our basic form that doesn't have these things on it, then that adds up to 5 forms that a verb can take. And so then we're going to zoom in on that and talk about the 5 verb forms in English. So again, if you have 4 suffixes that you can attach to your verbs, and you also have a base form which can appear with no suffixes, then you have a total of 5 forms. This chart presents examples of 4 verbs and all their forms. 2 of them are regular verbs, and 2 are irregular verbs. Each of the forms has 2 names. I've put one in purple and one in red, and I'll talk about why it's probably better if you go by the purple term. So let's begin going through. We have the base form, jump, stay, forget, drive. When we want to say he, she, or it does these things in the present tense, then we have the third person present singular form and in present tense, and that's just adding the little s. And notice that this happens across the board. So regular and irregular verbs actually aren't that different. They're much more similar than they are different. This is one of the endings that gets applied whether it's regular or irregular. Jumps, stays, forgets, drives. Now we come to the ed form, past tense, and here we see why it's better to go by the purple term than the red name for these forms, because we don't always get ed. So it's you can think of like, oh, somebody wanted to call it the ed form because that's the regular ending. But it's better to just call it the past tense because we get the ed in regular verbs, but we get something else in irregular verbs, usually a vowel change. So we go from forget to forgot and drive to drove. It's only in the regular verbs that we get the ed. So if you just call it past tense, that clearly captures both options, whereas ed, it's a little misleading to call it the ed form for the irregular verbs because they don't actually have ed. We don't say forgetted and drived. Then we have the present participle, and this one it is safe to call it the ing form because it's ing across the board, jumping, staying, forgetting, and driving. And then finally the past participle, the en form, and you probably don't want to call it the en form though because, it's good to call it that so that you know that in at least one of the types of verbs it's en. But with regular verbs, the past participle is going to look exactly the same as the past tense. So we have, I jumped yesterday, I have jumped many times. But in the irregular verbs, it's going to change and we get this en. So I forgot yesterday, I have forgotten. I drove yesterday, I have driven many miles. So we have 5 forms, and like I said, the regular and irregular verbs, they're more similar than they are different, but the difference happens in the past tense and the past participle. The past tense of regular verbs gets ed, irregular verbs, something else happens, and the past participle of irregular verbs gets en, and regular verbs, past participle, they just look like the past tense. If you're having trouble coming up with the past participle form, if you're a native speaker, you can try just filling in the blank in a sentence with the structure, I've never blanked before. So for example, I've never driven stick shift before, or I've never gone scuba diving, or I've never stayed in a haunted house before, where driven, gone, and stayed are the past participle forms of those verbs. If you're not a native speaker, maybe you can grab one and have them do this for you. Now, the only catch here is that even if you're a native speaker, some people will, for two verbs that I know of, eat and go, some people will use the past tense in this slot. So I've heard people fairly commonly saying, I've never went instead of I've never gone, and I've never ate instead of I've never eaten. And this is supposedly incorrect. According to prescriptive grammar rules, it's not standard English to say I've never ate and I've never went. You're supposedly need to say I've never eaten and I've never gone. I don't take a stance on what's right or wrong. It's just be aware of that some speakers will do that, at least for those two verbs. But for other verbs, you probably will automatically come up with the past participle form without variation by dialect. Now, most verbs in English are regular. They're highly regular. But the catch is that the most common verbs are irregular, and not just that, they're highly irregular. So these 6 verbs here, for example, are among the top 10 most common verbs in English, along with be. Be is an extremely irregular verb. I'm talking about to be. So let's go through these 6 and see how they're weird. So we have for the first word. Now, we do see an S in the third person singular present tense, but it's not just tacked on at the end. It's not have, haves, it's has, which is a little different. And it's similar with do and does. We get like a vowel change, do to It's just a little bit different looking, but mostly we're like, okay, I'm putting an S on it like I'm supposed to. The past tense, had and did, we get a D, but it's not haved and doed. It's had and did, so they're a little bit different too. Present participle is what we expect, having, doing. And then, like a well-behaved irregular verb, have has the same form for its past tense and its past participle. So just like we had I jumped yesterday, I have never jumped, we have I had and I have never had. But do is different. Do has something like ed in the past tense, but the past participle has something sort of like the en. It's not en, it's actually spelled ne, but it has an n in there, so it's a little bit similar. Now, I'd like you to stop the video and take a moment to try to come up with stop the video for as long as you need and try to come up with the third person present singular, past tense, present participle, and past participle for these other 4 verbs: say, make, go, and take. All right, if you're hearing me talking again, it should be because you completed the chart for those 4 verbs, say, make, go, and take, and you're ready to see what the answers are. So let's begin with say. So here are the 5 forms for say, and this is an interesting one because it almost looks like it shouldn't be on here. Like, why are we considering it irregular? Like, I told you don't worry too much about minor changes in spelling, so when you see S-A-I-D, the past tense, you might just think, well, that's like S-A-Y-D, so S-A-Y-E-D, so what's the problem? Why is this an irregular verb? We have a nice S and ing, and we have the same form for past tense and past participle. It's regular. But the reason we say it's irregular is that there are pretty intense vowel changes. So even though we don't represent those with the spelling, when we go from the base form say to the present tense third person present singular says, we switch from a, say, a sound to to says, says. say, says. So it's actually quite different. And the same with said, we get this it changes. So it's not like jump, jumps. It goes say, says. And you can imagine how people who are learning English as a second language, they mix this up, and they might say things like, that's what he says, and get corrected and said, no, it says. Or they might say, that's what he said yesterday, and they would get told, no, it's said. So it's a little irregular. Certainly strikes learners of English as very irregular. So if seeing the answers to this one made you realize that some of your answers to the other three words, make, go, and take, might be incorrect, you should pause it now and go and try to fix those. You'll learn more that way, but if not, if you think your answers are all okay, then let's just keep going on to make. So here we have the forms for make, and at first glance this might look like a regular verb, but then you realize that the past tense, if it was regular, would be maked, M-A-K-E-D, but instead it's made. But beyond that, we do have the same form for the past participle and the past tense, but it's irregular because it's not makes, make. It's not make, makes, maked. It's made. Next are the forms for the verb to go. And so here we have go, goes, like we would expect. It's not like do, does, or say, says, where the vowel changes, so that's quite regular. And then we have going and gone. It's not quite an en form, but at least there's an n in there, like done. But the really weird, crazy thing happens with the past tense went. Why on earth does it change from go to went? And that's because historically this actually comes from a different word, and it got squished together with go. So that's why went is so weird. Now with this verb to take, we finally have what you could call a regular irregular verb. So all the other verbs in this list they're all irregular, but the other ones are so irregular that they're pretty unpredictable. But this one is predictable, so most irregular verbs in their past tense, they take some sort of vowel change, like we saw with drive, drove. So here we have take, took. And it takes the en form for its past participle, like drive, driven, ride, ridden. Here we have take, taken. It's the only one in this list that actually takes the en that I sort of promised you that irregular verbs would take as their past participle. So this might feel frustrating, like, why did you tell me that en is the past participle form for irregular verbs when 5 out of 6 of the ones you're showing me do something different? But it's just the way English is. These are extremely common verbs, and when words are extremely common, we tolerate a lot of irregularity with them. So these are highly irregular verbs, except for take. Take is more typical of irregular verbs overall. So you'll see if you start thinking of other words that most irregular verbs will be more predictable than have, do, say, make, and go. Now, I've been talking about the 5 forms that every verb in English takes, but we do have one highly exceptional verb, and this is our verb to be, which is, I believe, the most common verb in English. And it has 8 forms instead of 5, and it's the only one like this. Where do the extra forms come from? Well, number 1, it has a special form just for the infinitive, be. Number 2, it has 3 present tense forms, am, are, is, instead of the usual 2. And the third extra form comes from the past tense, where it has 2, one for singular and one for plural, instead of the usual 1 option for past tense. The infinitive form, so far, I've been talking about the base form, and so far that has been the same for the infinitive, which is the form of the verb that comes after the little particle to, like I want to go. The go is the infinitive there. And usually it looks exactly the same as what comes after most of the pronouns, like I go, you go, they go, everything except he, she, it goes. So usually those are the same. I want to go and I go. But in this case, they're different. Infinitive, by the way, just means it has no tense. So finite means it has tense. It can be past, present, or future. And infinitive just means non-finite, meaning non-tensed. So when you say to be, we don't know if you're talking about the past or the present or the future. So be is special, and it gets these these 8 forms instead of the usual 5, but all the other verbs will follow the rule of having 5 forms. Finally, we get to see our 12 tense aspects in English laid out in a chart. And there's actually 2 charts because I wanted to show what it looked like for an irregular verb on top and a regular verb on the bottom. But remember, I said that regular and irregular verbs are actually more similar than they are different. The only place where they're different in this chart is the boxes that are in gray, so in the past simple and in the perfect. So in the past simple for the regular verb, we get ed, and we don't get that in the past simple for the irregular verb. And in the perfect, for the irregular verb, we get en, and for the regular verb, we get ed. Because remember, we said the past participle for regular verbs is the same as the past tense. But for irregular verbs, the past participle gets that en. Now, past, present, and future are pretty straightforward. Those are our tenses. That's the tense part of the tense aspect chart. Most people don't, or nobody has trouble with those. But where people start to find it a little more different from what they just naturally already know about English is the aspects. So we have simple, progressive, perfect, and perfect progressive. And there's actually so much that can be said about what these mean and the situations in which we use them. I am unfortunately going to give you a very impoverished view of it because my goal here is to focus on getting you to helping you recognize the forms and be able to name them. So be able to see them, recognize them, give them their proper label, or be able to produce examples of regular or irregular verbs in any of the 12 tense aspects on command. Like I said, I have to leave out a lot about the nuances of how we use them. I'm going to present a simplified view so that it's digestible, but just trust me that there's a lot more to it than that, and it's actually a very fascinating area of research in linguistics. But let's begin. So, simple, by the way, aspect refers to the manner, something about the nature of the action, because verbs are about actions, and past, present, and future tense tells us about when it happened, and the aspect tells us some more about it, something about the nature of that action. You can think of simple as the default aspect. It's like I ate, I go, I went, I see, I will go tomorrow. These are all in the simple aspect. The progressive, which is also called the continuous, means that an action is ongoing. So notice that when I described what it means, I used an ing verb. It's ongoing. It's in progress. That's why it's called the progressive. Or continuous is also a helpful name. So whether you call it the progressive or the continuous, the names are pretty helpful. Perfect means that the perfect aspect is used when you want to talk about how one action took place before another action. Now that might sound like the perfect refers to the past tense, but it can be the case that both of these actions happened in the past or both of them happened in the future. It doesn't matter, but the point is just that one happened before the other. So when I say, by the time he came over to have dinner with me, I had already eaten all the food, my eating the food happened before he came, and so that's what's important there. Both of the actions happened in the past, but one of them happened before the other. Likewise, you could say, by the time he gets home, we will have already eaten all the food. Notice I keep using already. That tends to be helpful when you're coming up with examples of the perfect. So by the time he gets home, we'll have already eaten all the food. Again, the eating the food happened before this person came. And you can say things like, have you finished your homework? Yeah, I have finished my homework. And here the second thing is not really a particular action, but just the current time. So if you say, I have finished my homework, it happened sometime before the person asked you about it. So there's always something that happened before something else. And the perfect progressive just sort of combines both of these. So it has elements of both in terms of the forms that it has and in terms of its meaning. Now here we have color-coded charts. So if the charts on the previous slide, if it seemed like a lot to take in, hopefully color coding it will make it more obvious. what the patterns are, because it's actually not so much to learn. A lot of it is the same, especially across regular and irregular verbs. So, for example, we see that I put the word will in green. So we see that no matter what the tense, no matter what the aspect, if it's in the future, it's going to have the word will in it. So I will eat, I will be eating, I will have eaten, I will have been eating, I will talk, will be talking, will have talked, will have been talking. The other pattern is what happens with the progressive. So you have your present participle, the ing, and whether it's a regular verb or an irregular verb, you're going to see the ing on there. The other thing you're going to see on there is the be verb acting as what we call an auxiliary. So that means it's not the main verb. Sort of like how you may have heard modal verbs or helping verbs. Auxiliaries are not the main verb either. They are something other than the main verb. So even though it looks like a lot of different things there, was, were, am, are, is, and be, it all boils down to the verb be, because remember it had all those different forms, and here we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. And by the way, so you can go back mentally to when I talked about Russian and all the different verb forms in Russian, even just in the present simple. Here for us in the present simple in English, all I have to do to include all the different forms for the present simple is add a little s in parentheses. I eat, you eat, he eats, they eat, we eat. The only one that gets the s is he, she, it eats. So I can easily convey that by just putting an s in parentheses. But remember, Russian, in the present simple, that's the chart I gave you for the verb read, was the present simple. Russian has 6 different forms. So they couldn't make the tense aspect, they couldn't make a tense aspect chart that's as condensed as ours, because what we're conveying with that little s, they would have 6 different endings, and so they'd probably want to make different charts for the different tenses or for the different pronouns. But so we're very lucky with English that in that sense it's much simpler. And yeah, we have to have some things in slashes here, so I can't put a s in parentheses after have, because we don't say I have, he, she, it has, we say has. But so that's why there's some slashes here, just because sometimes the different pronouns call for slightly different versions of the words. But everything in blue there to the left of the verb it's just the verb be. Was, were, am, are, is, and be are all forms of the verb be, and they're all called auxiliary be. So progressive, whether it's regular or irregular, will have auxiliary be before the verb and an ing after the verb. That's our present participle. Perfect is similar, but there's a little more variation. So the perfect forms, you'll see they always have before them, before the verb. That's our auxiliary have, because it's not the main verb have, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So it always has have or had or has before it, and it always, for eat, it always has en after it. So that's our irregular verb, and they take that en ending. And then the regular verbs will take the ed. Now, remember we talked about some verbs that were highly irregular, but those are exceptional. Generally, a well-behaved regular verb is going to take a d or ed sound at the end, and a well-behaved irregular verb, even though it's irregular, within its irregularity, it will be regular and well-behaved, and it'll take an en at the end, or sometimes just an n, like the verb done. And also notice that even be has a form like this. We have been, B-E-E-N. So, just like progressive has auxiliary be plus ing, the perfect will have auxiliary have and the en or the ed, and that's our past participle form. That we called that the en form, but remember with regular verbs it's going to be ed, the same as the past simple. And then you look at the perfect progressive, the most complicated. It's not very commonly used, as you might imagine, and it literally squishes progressive and perfect together. So we get the auxiliary have, and we get our ing, and we get our en, but it's attached to the be instead of to the main verb eat. or talk, but both components are in there. So progressive and perfect both have something that comes before the verb and after the verb. It's systematic. Now, to summarize what I just said and add a little more, actually, systematic things that we see in the charts are that there's always going to be will with the future tense, no matter what the aspect. So future simple, future progressive, future perfect, and future perfect progressive all have will in them. The progressive will always have auxiliary be in some form, whether it's is or be or am, and ing to form our present participle form of the verb. The perfect will always have auxiliary have, and it almost always has either ed or en, but there are some weird verbs like done, where it just ends in n, spelled ne, or been, well, been has an en. There are some verbs that break this rule, but it almost always has ed or en. And then something I meant to say, but I can say it here, is that when there's any sort of auxiliary, whether it's be or have, then the past and the present tense are going to be shown on the auxiliary. And I have in parentheses first there because in perfect progressive, we have both of the auxiliaries in there. But the auxiliary, or the first auxiliary, is going to be the one where we see the tense expressed, not the main verb. So this can confuse some people. But for example, past perfect, we had eaten. Present perfect, he has eaten or I have eaten. Eaten doesn't change. We don't have ate in there anywhere. So if you're looking for ate because it's past tense, you're not going to find it except in the simple. In the perfect, in the progressive, we don't have ate. It's the have, or the have that carries it in the perfect, and the be that carries it in the progressive. So it's past perfect, so it's had eaten. Present perfect is has or have eaten. Future perfect is will have eaten, but eaten doesn't change. Similar thing with the progressive. So we don't see the present participle form change. It's always the present participle eating, but what changes is the be form. So we get was eating is the past, and am eating is the present, or are eating or is eating, and will be eating is the future. And when we combine these into the past perfect progressive, we have the first auxiliary gets the tense. So had been eating and has or have been eating. But we don't see ate in the past, and we don't see eats in the present. It's going to be one of our two participles, present participle or past participle. So if you want to stop the video now and go look at the charts some more and try to process all this, you can, but I'm going to go on into the next topic. You may have noticed I've been throwing around the term auxiliary verb a lot, regarding auxiliary have and auxiliary be in the tense aspect chart. And so I'd like to address that topic explicitly now, and also sort of as a bonus throw in another auxiliary verb, auxiliary do. Even though it doesn't appear in the charts, it's incredibly important in English, and while we're talking about auxiliaries, we might as well talk about it. And the first thing to talk about when you talk about auxiliaries is how to say it. So it's pronounced auxiliary, auxiliary. In the far right there we have the phonetic transcription, and in the middle I have a sort of pseudo-phonetic transcription for people who aren't familiar with the phonetic alphabet. But if you're not sure how to say it correctly and you just don't want to risk ever saying it out loud in front of other people, you can just call it aux, and that makes it easier. Okay, so aux, or auxiliary. So we've seen that we have auxiliary have when we're in the perfect aspect. So I had eaten, I have eaten, I will have eaten. But have can also act as a main verb. All of these auxiliary verbs that I'm going to talk about can act as main verbs. So how do you know the difference? Well, in the second sentence here, I have a car. Have is not an auxiliary. It's acting as the main verb, a regular verb there. And how do we know this? Well, one test, although it's not perfect, is can you substitute, and this test is only for have, not for the other auxiliaries, can you substitute the word own or possess? So I have a car is the same as I own a car or I possess a car. So we know that we have the main verb there. This test isn't perfect because some things that we use have as the main. In some situations, when we use have as the main verb, it would be weird to talk about ownership or possession. So, for example, I have the flu. It would be weird to say I own the flu or I possess the flu, or I have a wonderful math teacher. You don't own her, so we can't always use that test. But if you can substitute have or own, if you can substitute possess or own, then you know you have the main verb. But the other way to know if you have the main verb is if it is the only verb, then you know it's the main verb, because every sentence needs a main verb, but not every sentence does not need a aux. So if there's only one, like in I have a car, that's your main verb. Versus I have eaten, the main verb there is eat, and then have comes before it, acting as aux. Those are in present tense. The first one is I have eaten, that's present perfect. The second one is I have a car, which is present simple. Now we have past perfect, she had seen me, and past simple, she had brown eyes. And this is one where we can't really say she owned brown eyes, but it is the main verb there nevertheless, and it's the only verb in the sentence. Whereas she had already seen me, we have two verbs. We have had and seen. So had is acting as aux, and seen is the main verb. That's the main thing that's happening there, is the act of seeing. So one test is seeing if you can substitute own or possess. Another is asking, is this the only verb in the sentence? And another way of just understanding the difference between the two is coming up with sentences where you have both of them. So I have had enough has both auxiliary have and then main verb have. I've had enough. Another thing, so that's not really a test because I'm saying you should come up with sentences rather than looking at a sentence and trying to figure out what's going on. But a third test is, it works in American English at least, if you're a native speaker, is that we can make a contraction out of aux have, but we wouldn't do that for main verb have. So we can say I've eaten, I've already eaten. In speech we do this all the time. She'd already seen me, I've had enough, but we don't make a contraction out of main verb have, so we don't say I've a car. But I think in British English they can do that, but Americans don't do that, so that's another test you can use. Now there's also the be can serve as aux, and we saw this in the progressive. So I was going, I am going, I will be going. I was eating, I am eating, I will be eating. It always has that aux be. But of course be can also be a main verb in a sentence. So we are learning grammar versus we are students. Are is acting quite differently in both of those sentences. In the first sentence, the main verb is learning. That's the main thing that's happening. And in the second sentence, our only option for a main verb is are. Likewise, now we have the past progressive and past simple. The past progressive, the child was being difficult. The past simple, it's because the child was tired. Again, we can use the test of seeing if it's the only verb in the sentence, in which case we know that was and child was tired is the main verb. And then in the child was being difficult, we have two verbs. So the first one is the aux, and the second one is the main verb. I promised I would give you one more auxiliary as a sort of bonus, and here it is. This is auxiliary do, as in Harold doesn't enjoy blind dates. Auxiliary do is pretty rare as far as languages around the world go. It's kind of a funky thing that happens in English and that can be difficult for people who are learning English as a second or a foreign language to master. It appears in 3 situations, but when I say that, I mean it can appear. It doesn't always appear in these situations. It appears when there isn't another auxiliary that can serve the same role. So it sort of steps in when nobody else is there to do the job, and that's why we sometimes call this do support. So it appears in certain negated sentences, like Harold doesn't enjoy blind dates. The non-negated version of that sentence, Harold enjoys blind dates, doesn't need a does. It could have one, but then it would mean something else that we'll talk about. So Harold enjoys blind dates, but when we make it negative, and it's a sentence like that in the present simple, it doesn't have any other aux that can play this role, so we stick do in there. Harold doesn't enjoy blind dates. But if it has a auxiliary have, then that could play the same role. So Harold hasn't eaten. Harold has eaten dinner. Harold hasn't eaten dinner. Harold is eating dinner. Harold isn't eating dinner. There we have the progressive be, the progressive with the auxiliary be. But when there's no aux be and there's no aux have, and there's nothing else that can play that kind of role, we need the do to step in. It also can appear in questions, again, if there's no other aux to fill that role. So Harold loves Maud. When you make a question out of it, you say, does Harold love Maud? If it was in the perfect, you could say, Harold has loved Maud for 10 years, and then you could make a question and use the have. Has Harold loved Maud for 10 years? But when there's no have, and there's no other thing that can do the same thing that do will do for us, then we need to put in our aux do. And then I gave you a question that has do as a main verb in it, because again, do can be a main verb too. So he does that. Does he do that? And the first do is auxiliary do, and the second do is the main verb do there. It also shows up in WH questions, again, when there's no other aux or aux-like thing that can fill that role. So who does he love? He loves her. Who does he love? And again, a sentence that has do as the main verb, so you do that. How do you do that? It's not grammatical to say who he love and how you do that. We have to have the do in there. And then there's something called tag questions, and these are the little things that go at the end, like doesn't he and didn't you? Where you're questioning the main sentence, making a question about the main sentence. So like, he loves Maud, doesn't he? You went, didn't you? And again, we use auxiliary do here if there's nothing else that can fill that role. Of course, if you have, you can say hasn't he or hasn't he, but when you don't have that, you need the do. And then finally, I said that when I said Harold enjoys blind dates, we don't need we don't put a do in there, but we can, but it would change the meaning. What I meant is that if you say Harold does love Maud, it's grammatical, but it has a certain purpose. Your purpose there is to be emphatic, to emphasize, like, he really, really does love Maud. Maybe someone else said that he didn't, and you're correcting them, saying, no, he does love Maud. This comes up when kids are arguing, and they say, like, did not, did to. So I never said that. You did too say it, where you're emphasizing, like, yes, you did say it. So these are the situations where we can use it, but as I said, it happens if something else, if it's not the case that something else can play that role, such as auxiliary have. So this summarizes what I was saying as I went along. When you have a sentence like I ate, which is in the past simple, you change it into negated version, I didn't eat, or question, did I eat, what did I eat, tag question, I ate, didn't I, and all of these, or I did eat, you need the auxiliary do. But if you have the perfect sentence, perfect aspect sentence, I have eaten, then have can play that role in all of those situations. You can say, I have not eaten, have I eaten, what have I eaten, I've eaten, haven't I, and I have eaten. So we only use do when sort of it's needed, when nothing else can play that role, and again, that's why we call it do support. Final thing that I said I would talk about when I went over the preview of what this lesson would be about was the interesting fact that English technically has no future tense. What we mean by this is not that there's no way to express the future in English, but that I've sort of been lying to you when I gave you the tense aspect charts and I said here's the future simple or the future progressive. English has no future tense in the sense that it does not have a way of changing the verb to indicate the future, like we do for the past. So we can put an ed on a verb and turn it into past tense, but we cannot do that and show the future tense. We don't have an equivalent of ed for the future. But no matter, we have other ways of expressing the future. Languages that don't have future tense, like English, one way that they get around that is they tend to use modal verbs. So will and I will go, even though we sort of tell people that that's the future tense in English, technically that will is a modal verb that's letting us express the future. And that's a common thing that languages do. So they take these modal verbs and use them to express the future, like I said. Another common way of expressing future in English is with going to. We call this the going to future, or the go future. And I'm purposely using an example with the word go here so you can see the difference between the go future go and the main verb go. An interesting thing about going to future is that this is the going to that we can contract into gonna. You can't squish going to into gonna unless it's the go future. So what I mean by that is you can say I'm going to go, and you can say I'm gonna go. And you can say I'm going to the store, and that's the main verb go. You can't say I'm gonna the store. You can only say gonna if it's the thing that you're contracting into gonna is the going to of the go future. Another way of expressing the future in English is to just use the present tense. We call this the present tense future. We can say things like, my bus leaves at 4 a.m. tomorrow. Now notice that it's only because there's that word tomorrow in there that this is interpreted as the future. If I just said my bus leaves at 4 a.m. and you didn't have any other context, you might take that to mean my bus habitually leaves at 4 a.m. Like I take this bus commonly. And that is another use of the present simple, is to express things that happen habitually. I said that I have to skip over a lot of the interesting nuances of how we use the different tense aspects, and that's one of the things I had to skip over, is that we use the present tense not just for things that are happening now, but for things that happen regularly. Sort of similarly, we can use the progressive, and this can convey the future, so the progressive tense future. She's competing in Florida next week. Again, it's only because there's that word, that time-related word, next week, that we take this to mean the future. If I said she's competing in Florida right now, it would just be the regular present progressive. So with those last two, the only reason that we interpret them as meaning the future is that we need these words like tomorrow or next week. But as long as you have those words, then you are able to use the present tense or the progressive tense to convey the future. So even though we don't technically have a future tense in English, we do just fine without it. Now it's time for a summary. As I've said, everything in this video lesson, it all boils down to this chart, the tense aspect chart, and the 12 tense aspects of English. Everything I've said is sort of build up to background knowledge that's necessary, or build up to that, or further explanations of that. And even the one thing I described as a little bit peripheral, auxiliary do, I called it a bonus. It's actually relevant too. It's just I've been giving you very simple sentences like I have eaten, and I have been eating, and we are talking. And those don't have auxiliary do in them, but the sentences that have auxiliary do in them, they can all be categorized. They can all be labeled as past, present, or future, and simple, progressive, perfect, or perfect progressive too. So I do eat is present simple, and I did eat is past simple, and do you eat is a question, and it has the auxiliary do inserted, and that is present simple as well. So even though auxiliary do doesn't appear in these charts, it is, it's not like sentences that have auxiliary do aren't in some tense and some aspects. So I've just been keeping it simple by avoiding questions, passive voice, and negation, the kinds of things that would require auxiliary do or emphasis. But if you see a sentence with auxiliary do in it, then it is possible to label that sentence as well as falling into one of these tense aspects. So what are the other things I talked about aside from auxiliary do? I began the whole video by talking about gender, number, and person. And the reason I talked about that was that these are all things that can greatly affect verb forms in the different tense aspects in a language. Now it happens that in English, gender is irrelevant, but in many languages it would be relevant. And we don't see many effects of number and person in English, but we do see it with the third person present singular. So since I was going to talk about how one of the 5 verb forms has an S, and that's the third person present singular, I needed to explain what person meant and what I meant by singular versus plural there. So that's our little S on eats, and talks. And then we moved into talking about the five verb forms. So we have our base form, like eat and go and talk. And then we have the past tense, which with regular verbs is an ed. And with irregular verbs, it could be a lot of things. It's often a vowel change, like eat to ate, or run, ran, and so on. We also have the third person present singular, so that's 3. And then we have our 2 participles, that makes 4 and 5, so ing and en. But remember I said it was better to call those, it's better to call those the present participle and the past participle than to call them the ing form and the en form, because even though the present participle will always have an ing, the past participle, it only has the en if it's, most irregular verbs have that. But if it's a regular verb, it's going to be ed. So you can say, give me the en form of the verb talk, but that's a little weird sounding because talk doesn't ever take en. It's probably better to call it the past participle. So we have our base form, our third person present singular, past tense, and present participle ing, past participle en, or with regular verbs it'll be ed. And then once you knew all those forms, I threw the chart at you, and though I did not introduce it at the time, though I did not explicitly introduce it at the time, by giving you the chart, I also gave you auxiliaries, auxiliary have and auxiliary be. And we looked at the chart and we saw the patterns that you could see across it, so when we color coded it. So anything that's in the future has will, anything that's in the progressive has auxiliary be plus the ing form, anything that's in the perfect has auxiliary have, and then it's going to have en or ed, and perfect progressive combines both of those things. We also talked about how aside from the simple aspect, the past and present tense is going to be marked, it's going to be expressed through the auxiliary, not through the main verb. So in simple aspect we have ate, eats, will eat, but in the progressive we just have eating, eating, eating. The only thing that shows the tense is was, were eating versus am, are, is eating. And again, in the perfect, across the board, past, present, future, we have eaten, 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 talked, talked, talked. Where we see the tense is on the have. Had eaten, has eaten, or have eaten, and will have eaten. And you see something similar in the perfect progressive. It's the first auxiliary, the have, that gets the tense. Had been eating, has been eating, or have been eating, will have been eating. But across the board there, from past, present, and future, it's always eating. So the main verb doesn't change, except in the simple aspect. And then finally we talked about auxiliary do, which is fresh in our minds, so I don't need to go over that again, and talked about how English doesn't really have a future. Instead of putting some sort of ending on the verb like we do when we make the past tense, we grab this modal verb, will, and we sort of force it into the service of expressing the future. Another very common way of expressing the future, of course, is using the verb go. So I'm going to go, I'm going to eat, and so on. That is another option that we have. So I hope this has been helpful to anyone watching this, and especially to my students. You can email me if you have questions, or if you have any issues with the homework. But these are the 12 tense aspects of English, and thank you for sitting with me for an hour.